They say silence is golden, but my parents treated my daughter's silence like a defect. For 12 years, they mocked her as a stain on our pristine bloodline while worshipping my nephew's hollow accolades. Little did they know, my supposedly slow child was secretly conversing with the world's greatest minds. Tonight, when the champagne glass shatters, I will show them that what they discarded is exactly what the rest of the world is desperate to find. My name is Martha Oakmont, and for the last 7 years, walking up the driveway of the Sterling estate has felt less like returning home and more like entering a courtroom where the verdict has already been decided. The estate, a sprawling architectural beast of limestone and arrogance nestled in the wealthiest zip code of Connecticut, was ablaze with light. It was the 45th wedding anniversary of my parents, Evelyn and Richard Ashford, and true to form, they had turned a personal milestone into a spectator sport. Every window of the 3-story mansion glowed with a golden warmth that was entirely artificial, designed to convince the world that the people inside were as luminous as the chandeliers hanging above their heads. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, a simple navy piece that I had bought off the rack, knowing full well it would be the subject of ridicule before the appetizers were even served. Beside me walked Lily. At 12 years old, my daughter was a striking contrast to the manicured perfection of the Ashford grounds. She wore her favorite oversized hoodie, the one that swallowed her slight frame, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones that were practically glued to her ears, in her hands. She clutched a tablet that was so old the casing was chipped at the corners, a device my mother had once referred to as industrial waste. Lily was not looking at the manicured hedges or the fleet of luxury cars valeted near the fountain. She was looking at the screen, her fingers tapping in a rhythm only she could hear, navigating a world of logic and order that was invisible to everyone else here. We ascended the grand staircase, the marble cold beneath my heels. The heavy oak doors swung open, unleashed a wave of climate-controlled air scented with expensive lilies and old money. The foyer was already packed. The crème de la crème of Connecticut society had gathered to pay homage to the Ashford dynasty. I saw senators, hedge fund managers, and board members of Fortune 500 companies, all holding crystal flutes of champagne, their laughter sounding like broken glass rattling in a tin. As we stepped onto the plush Persian rug, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Heads turned. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered in volume, transforming from chatter into a low, buzzing hum. I felt the familiar prickle of heat on the back of my neck. I kept my head high, my hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder, not to guide her, but to ground myself. Then came the whispers. They were not meant to be heard, yet they were projected with the precision of stage actors. "Is that the girl?" A woman in emerald silk murmured behind her fan, tilting her head toward Lily. "I heard she is 12, but functions like a toddler." "Tragic," her companion replied, swirling his scotch. "Poor Martha. The Ashford line has always been pristine. Recessive genes are a terrifying thing, aren't they?" "She isn't even looking at anyone," another voice chimed in, dripping with faux concern. "Does she understand where she is? My God, look at those headphones. It is like she is piloting a helicopter." I tightened my grip on my clutch. These people saw a broken child. They saw a genetic error. They saw a stain on the immaculate tapestry of the Ashford legacy. For years, I had let these whispers bleed me dry. I had let them shame me into silence. I remembered the gala 3 years ago, when my father had explicitly told me to leave Lily with a nanny because her ticking, a self-soothing habit she had back then, would distract the potential investors. I had obeyed. I had hidden my daughter away like a shameful secret, weeping in the bathroom while they toasted to family values. But not tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight, the script was going to change, even if none of them knew their lines yet. Across the room, the crowd parted like the Red Sea to reveal my sister, Clarissa, and her son, Preston. If Lily was the error, Preston was the correction. also 12 years old. Preston looked like a miniature version of a corporate raider. He was dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than my car. His hair gelled back in a style that screamed entitlement. He stood with his chin tilted up, a smirk playing on his lips as he held court with a group of adults who were fawning over him. "He is a prodigy," I heard my father boasting to a local judge nearby, gesturing toward Preston. "Top of his class at St. Jude's, captain of the debate team, a true Ashford." Clarissa spotted us, her eyes, heavily lined and sharp as flint, swept over me and landed on Lily. A look of distaste curled her lip, barely there, gone in a second, replaced by a mask of pity that was far more insulting than open hostility. She didn't approach us. She simply turned back to the circle of admirers, effectively dismissing our existence. "Martha!" The voice was melodious, commanding, and laced with distinct disapproval. My mother, Evelyn Ashford, glided toward us. She was wearing a silver gown that shimmered under the lights, diamonds dripping from her neck and ears. She looked like a queen, and I was the peasant who had wandered into the throne room uninvited. "You made it," she said, presenting her cheek for a kiss, but not actually making contact. She pulled back and looked down at Lily. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. It was a barrier, a shield of politeness. "And you brought Lily." "Hello, Mother," I said, my voice steady. "Happy anniversary." Mother didn't respond to the well-wishing. Her gaze was fixed on the headphones and the battered tablet in Lily's hands. "Martha, really, we are about to take the family portraits for the society page. You cannot possibly let her wear that contraption in the photos, and that thing in her hands. It looks like something dredged out of a recycling bin." "It is her computer, Mother," I said. "She is working." "Working?" Mother let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. "She is playing video games. Martha, do not delude yourself. Now, Lily, darling." She bent down, invading Lily's personal space. Lily didn't flinch, didn't look up. Her eyes were darting across the screen, tracking streams of data that would make the encryption on my mother's jewelry safe look like a child's puzzle. "Lily," Mother said louder, snapping her fingers in front of Lily's face, "put the cheap electronic toy away. Grandma wants a picture." Lily did not blink. She did not pause. She was thousands of miles away, traversing a digital landscape of her own creation. Mother straightened up, her face flushing pink with embarrassment. She looked around at the guests who were watching the interaction. "She is a bit slow," Mother announced to the room, her voice pitching up to a sympathetic register. "The doctors say it is a processing issue. We have to be very patient. You understand?" The guests nodded solemnly, murmuring their sympathies. "So difficult for the family," someone whispered. "St. Evelyn, dealing with such a burden." I felt the anger ignite in my chest, a hot, dense coal burning behind my ribs. Slow, the word hung in the air, heavy and toxic. If only they knew. If only they knew that the slow child they were pitying was currently optimizing a server farm in Tokyo while simultaneously running a simulation on quantum decay. But I said nothing, not yet. "Just stand in the back, Martha," Mother sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "Try to hide the headphones behind Preston's shoulder. We need the photo to look cohesive." Clarissa and Preston drifted over for the photo. Preston looked at Lily with a sneer that seemed practiced in the mirror. He held a glass of sparkling water in his hand, swirling it boredly. "Hey, Space Cadet," Preston hissed, low enough that the adults couldn't hear, but loud enough for me. "Nice tablet. Did you find it in the garbage?" Lily didn't react. She tapped a final sequence on the screen, her lips moving silently as she muttered a variable. Preston, annoyed by her lack of reaction, decided to escalate. I saw it happen in slow motion. He took a step closer, feigning a stumble. His intention was clear, to spill the sparkling water all over Lily's hoodie, humiliating her right before the camera flash, forcing her to be removed from the picture to be cleaned up. It was a classic Preston move, cruelty disguised as an accident. "Oops!" Preston cried out theatrically as he tipped the glass. The water arched through the air, aimed perfectly at Lily's chest. But Lily didn't panic. She didn't gasp. She simply shifted. It was a movement of absolute economy. A slight pivot of her torso to the left, barely 2 inches. She didn't look up from her screen. She didn't break her typing rhythm. It was as if she had calculated the trajectory of the water with her peripheral vision and solved the equation of evasion instantly. The water missed her completely. Instead, it splashed heavily onto Preston's own bespoke trousers and polished Italian shoes as his momentum carried him forward into the empty space where Lily had just been. "Ah!" Preston shrieked, jumping back, dropping the glass. It shattered on the marble floor. "My suit! It is wet! It is freezing!" The room went silent. "Preston!" Clarissa gasped, rushing to him. "She pushed me!" Preston yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Lily. "The freak pushed me!" Lily was still typing. She hadn't touched him. She hadn't even looked at him. Mother turned on me, her eyes blazing with fury. "Martha, look what your daughter did! Preston is soaking wet!" "She didn't touch him, Mother," I said calmly, my voice cutting through the hysteria. "He tripped." "Do not lie for her," Mother snapped. "She is clumsy. She is uncoordinated. And now she has ruined Preston's outfit. He can't be in the photos like this. It looks like he wet himself." "It is okay, Mother," Clarissa soothed, glaring at me with venom. "We all know Lily has issues with spatial awareness. It is not her fault she is like a bull in a china shop. It is just a shame she has to ruin everyone else's night because of it." She turned to the guests, offering a martyr's smile. "I apologize. Everyone, my niece gets overwhelmed easily. Sometimes she lashes out." "I will take him to get changed," Clarissa said, guiding a whining Preston away. "Martha, maybe you should take Lily to the kitchen. The noise here is obviously too much for her simple mind." I stood there, surrounded by the accusing stares of the elite. They looked at Lily with disgust, at me with pity. They saw a disaster. I looked down at my daughter. Lily finished her sequence. She hit enter with a decisive tap of her thumb. For a microsecond, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the satisfaction of a code executing perfectly. She had calculated the dodge. She had anticipated the trajectory. She had let Preston defeat himself with his own inertia. I reached out and brushed a non-existent speck of dust from her shoulder. My heart was hammering, not with shame, but with anticipation. They thought she was broken. They thought she was the dumb one. They thought they could banish us to the kitchen, to the shadows, to the footnotes of the family history. Let them have their photos. Let them have their appetizers and their judgments. "Wait," I told myself, the word echoing like a mantra in my head. Just a little longer. The trap was set. The code was running. And when the execution time arrived, the Sterling estate would not be standing on such firm ground. I guided Lily toward the corner of the room, not as a retreat, but as a general moving to the vantage point before the artillery began to fire. The night was young, and the real show hadn't even started yet. The memory always begins with the sound of a ticking clock. It was not a rhythmic, soothing sound, but a jagged, metallic hacking that seemed to slice through the sterile air of the specialist's office. 7 years ago, the world was a different place, and Martha Ashford was a different woman. She was younger, softer, and still held on to the fragile hope that her family's love was unconditional. That hope died in a doctor's office on a rainy Tuesday in November. Lily was 5 years old then. She sat on the crinkling paper of the examination table, her small legs dangling, staring intently at a dust mote floating in a shaft of light. She did not look up when her name was called. She did not flinch when the thunder rattled the window pane. To the outside world, she was a doll made of porcelain, beautiful but vacant. To Martha, she was a locked chest for which the key had been lost. The doctor, a man with kind eyes but a voice that lacked warmth. adjusted his glasses, and looked at the clipboard. He spoke in long, clinical sentences that felt like heavy stones being dropped into Martha's lap. He used words like auditory processing disorder and high-functioning autism, specifically referencing what was then commonly called Asperger's syndrome. He explained that Lily's brain did not filter sound like a typical person's. The hum of the refrigerator was as loud as a human voice, and the scratch of wool against skin was a scream. Martha remembered nodding, her hands gripping the strap of her purse until her knuckles turned white. It was terrifying. Yes, but it was also a relief. It meant her daughter was not broken, just different. It meant there was a map, however complex, to navigate this terrain. But when she took that map to her parents, they torched it. The dinner at the Ashford estate that following Sunday was burned into Martha's mind with the permanence of a scar. She had brought the medical reports, thinking they would explain Lily's silence, her lack of eye contact, her sudden meltdowns when the room got too loud. She thought her parents would offer support. Instead, her father, sitting at the head of the mahogany table like a judge at a tribunal, had barely looked at the papers before pushing them away. He had called it a stain. He did not use the medical terms. He used words like slow and defective. Her mother, sipping tea from a cup that cost more than Martha's monthly rent, had sighed with the weary disappointment of someone who had been sold a faulty appliance. They proposed a solution that made the blood drain from Martha's face. There was a boarding school, they said, a facility 300 miles north. It was discreet. It was for children who were difficult. It would keep Lily out of sight so the neighbors would not whisper, and the Ashford name would remain pristine. They wanted to hide her. They wanted to erase the glitch in their perfect lineage. When Martha refused, the atmosphere in the room shifted from cold to Arctic. That was the night the ultimatum was delivered. If she insisted on keeping the child and parading her dysfunction around town, the financial lifeline would be cut. No more trust fund, no more safety net. The pressure was like a physical weight, crushing the air out of the room. It was too heavy for Martha's husband. He was a man who enjoyed the comfort of the Ashford orbit, even if he resented their control. He looked at Lily, who was spinning a fork on the table, lost in the physics of the rotation, and he looked at the stony faces of his in-laws. He did not leave that night, but he left in spirit. 2 months later, he was gone entirely. He packed a bag while Martha was at the grocery store. He left a note saying he was not built for this, that the silence in the house was too loud, and that he could not watch his life derail because of a child who would never look him in the eye. Suddenly, Martha was alone. The silence her husband feared became her only companion, but she did not have the luxury of collapsing. The Ashford tap was turned off. The bank accounts dried up. The friends who used to invite her to galas suddenly stopped calling, their loyalty tied to her father's influence rather than her friendship. She found work at Blue Crate Logistics. It was a small, dusty shipping company on the industrial side of the city, a place where the air always smelled of diesel and damp cardboard. It was a humiliation by Ashford standards, a place for the uneducated, for the desperate. Martha took the job without hesitation, for the first time in her life. She learned the true value of $1. She worked in the dispatch office, staring at spreadsheets for 12 hours a day, earning $9 an hour. Her hands, once manicured, became dry and paper-cut. Her back ached from the cheap office chair, but every paycheck, meager as it was, felt like a victory. It paid for Lily's occupational therapy. It paid for the sensory-friendly clothes. It paid for the roof over their heads, a small, drafty apartment that was a far cry from the manor she grew up in. The cruelty of her situation was magnified by the contrast with her sister, Clarissa. While Martha was counting coupons to buy groceries, Clarissa was living the life Martha had forfeited. Clarissa's son, Preston, was the golden child. He was exactly 6 months older than Lily. He was loud, charismatic, and aggressively normal. The family newsletters, which her mother still sent to her out of habit or perhaps spite, were filled with Preston's achievements. Preston was accepted into the most prestigious private academy in the state. Preston was taking violin lessons from a concertmaster. Preston had won a ribbon at the Junior Equestrian Club. The numbers floated off the page, mocking her. Tuition fees of $30,000 a year, a violin worth $5,000, riding boots that cost more than Martha's car. Meanwhile, Lily was being expelled from the local public kindergarten. It happened 3 months into the school year. The principal called Martha into her office, a look of pitying exhaustion on her face. Lily was not aggressive. She explained. She did not bite or hit. She simply refused to exist within the parameters of the classroom. She would not sit in the circle during story time. She would not sing the songs when the other children played tag. Lily sat under the slide, arranging pebbles in intricate, spiraling lines. The teacher said she was a ghost in the room, lacking social interaction, and that her refusal to speak was disrupting the educational flow. So, Martha took her home. She converted the corner of their small living room into a classroom. She bought secondhand textbooks and tried to be the teacher Lily needed. It was grueling. There were days when Martha sat on the floor and wept while Lily stared blankly at a wall. Martha tried to teach her the alphabet in the standard way, with songs and bright pictures, but Lily would just look away. Then came the discovery that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and wet. Martha had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted from a double shift at Blue Crate. When she woke up, the apartment was silent. Panic surged through her chest. She ran into the kitchen, expecting disaster. Instead, she found art. Lily had taken a box of crayons, but she had not drawn flowers or suns or stick figures of a happy family. She had drawn on the wall, from the baseboard up to as high as her little arms could reach. The wall was covered in sequences: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. It was the Fibonacci sequence. Beside it were prime numbers, listed in perfect ascending order, winding around the kitchen cabinets like vines. There were geometric shapes that looked like fractals, drawn with a steady, precise hand that no 5-year-old should possess. Martha stared at the wall, her hand covering her mouth. She realized then that Lily was not slow. She was not empty. She was overflowing. Lily had taught herself to read at 4 years old, absorbing the symbols without ever feeling the need to vocalize them. She understood the structure of the world, but she spoke a language of logic, not of words. The next day, Martha made a decision that would mean skipping lunch for a month. She went to a pawn shop on 4th Street and bought a computer. It was an ugly thing, a bulky gray tower with a monitor that hummed like a trapped bee. It cost $150 when she set it up on the wobbly desk in the corner. Lily approached it with caution. She touched the keyboard. She watched the cursor blink on the black screen. It was as if a light switch had been flipped. For the first time, Lily sat still. Her hands, usually fluttering with nervous energy, settled onto the keys. She didn't treat it like a toy. She treated it like an instrument. Within a week, she had figured out how to access the command line. She wasn't playing games. She was exploring the architecture of the machine. She typed commands and watched the computer obey. It was a world of pure cause and effect, a world without sarcasm, without hidden meanings, without the confusing noise of human emotion. If the syntax was correct, the result was true. It was safe. It was the first time Martha saw her daughter smile. It wasn't a big, toothy grin. It was a small, tight curving of the lips, a look of profound satisfaction. But the world outside that apartment refused to understand. A month later, on a rare occasion, Martha's parents decided to visit. They said they were in the neighborhood, though the neighborhood was one they would typically lock their car doors driving through. They stood in the cramped living room, their expensive coats looking absurd against the peeling wallpaper. They did not ask how Martha was managing with the rent. They did not ask if she was happy. Their eyes went straight to the corner of the room where Lily was hunched over the keyboard, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide, unblinking eyes. The screen was filled with scrolling lines of white text, a basic code Lily was teaching herself by reverse engineering a calculator program. Martha's mother wrinkled her nose. She asked if this was what Martha did all day, letting the child rot in front of a screen. Martha tried to explain. She tried to tell them that Lily was building something, that she understood logic gates and variables in a way that adults struggled to grasp. She told them Lily had found her voice. Her father laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. He pointed his cane at the girl. He said Martha was a lazy mother for letting a television babysit her child. He called Lily a useless addict, a child who only knew how to push buttons because she was too simple to function in the real world. He said it was a tragedy that a girl of her bloodline was reduced to a glazed-eyed zombie staring at a game. He did not see the beauty of the code. He did not see the intellect required to write it. He only saw a child who didn't look at him, and therefore, a child who had no value. They left after 20 minutes, leaving a check on the table for $200, a sum that felt more like an insult than a gift. Martha tore the check into pieces. She went to the computer and sat beside her daughter. She watched the lines of code cascade down the screen, a waterfall of logic in a chaotic world. She placed her hand on Lily's shoulder. Lily did not pull away. She leaned, ever so slightly, into her mother's touch, while her fingers continued to dance across the keys, writing the future one keystroke at a time. The heavy oak doors of the Ashford estate always seemed to close with a finality that shut out the rest of the world, sealing the occupants inside a bubble of old money and ancient prejudices. It was late autumn, several months before the grand anniversary party was scheduled to take place, and the air inside the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and the suffocating perfume of self-congratulation. Tonight was a celebration. Preston, now 12 years old and wearing a blazer that cost more than Martha's car, had returned home with a trophy. He had won the state debate championship for his age division. To anyone else, it was a school accomplishment. To the Ashfords, it was a coronation. The dinner had been going on for 2 hours. For at least 30 minutes of that time, Arthur Ashford had been holding court, his wineglass raised, extolling the virtues of his grandson. He spoke of Preston not as a child, but as an investment that was finally maturing. He used phrases like natural-born leader and future senator, casting a warm, golden light on the boy who sat at his right hand. Soaking up the praise with a practiced, smug humility, Martha sat across from them, cutting her meat into tiny, precise squares. She felt like an intruder at her own family table. Beside her, Lily was silent. She was wearing a simple blue dress that Martha had found on sale, a stark contrast to the designer silk Clarissa was wearing. Lily wasn't eating. Her eyes were fixed on the intricate patterns of the lace tablecloth, her fingers tracing the invisible lines of geometry that wove through the fabric. Arthur finally set his glass down, the heavy crystal clinking against the table. He turned his gaze from the golden boy to the girl who refused to look at him. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, predatory amusement. He asked Lily if she had managed to complete her school year, or if she was being held back again. The question was a trap, and everyone at the table knew it. Lily did not attend a traditional school with grades to fail or pass. She was homeschooled by Martha, following a curriculum that moved at the speed of light compared to the standard education system, but Arthur refused to acknowledge this. To him, if it did not happen within the ivy-covered walls of a private academy, it did not count. Martha opened her mouth to defend her daughter, to explain that Lily was currently studying college-level linear algebra, but the words died in her throat. She knew it would only invite more ridicule. Lily did not answer. She did not even blink. Her attention had shifted. She was looking past her grandfather, toward the sideboard where an antique clock sat in a glass case. It was a French mantel clock, gilded and ornate, a relic from the 19th century. It had been broken for 10 years. Several horologists had examined it, shaken their heads, and declared the internal mechanism too seized with rust and age to be salvaged without destroying the casing. It sat there as a decorative paperweight, a symbol of static time, without a word. Lily stood up. The room went quiet. It was rare for Lily to move without being prompted. She walked to the sideboard. Her movements were fluid and direct. She opened the glass case. Arthur barked at her, asking what she thought she was doing. Lily ignored him. She reached behind the clock. Her slender fingers moved with a speed that was hard to track. She didn't have tools. She didn't have a manual. She had the uncanny ability to visualize the mechanics in her mind, to see the stress points and the misaligned gears as if the brass casing were made of glass. She found a small latch that the experts had missed, a tension spring that had jumped its track a decade ago. She applied pressure. A soft click echoed in the silent room. Then, she adjusted the pendulum weight, her touch as light as a feather. It took less than 2 minutes. She closed the glass case and turned back to the table. Her expression neutral. Arthur's face turned a deep, furious red. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He rushed over to the sideboard and snatched the clock up. Cradling it defensively, he shouted at her, demanding to know why she couldn't keep her hands to herself. He yelled that she was destroying a priceless heirloom. He looked at Martha and sneered, saying that even professional craftsmen had given up on this piece. So what could a clumsy, slow-witted child possibly do other than break it further? He was so consumed by his own rage, so deafened by the sound of his own voice, that he didn't hear it. Tick, tick, tick. The clock was working perfectly. The rhythm was steady and strong. But Arthur, holding the evidence of his granddaughter's genius in his hands, was too blinded by his prejudice to see it. He slammed the clock back down on the sideboard, ironically, risking damage to it himself, and stormed back to his seat, muttering about the need to lock up the valuables when Martha brought her girl over. Martha heard the ticking. She looked at Lily. Lily gave a microscopic shrug, picked up her fork, and finally took a bite of her potatoes. She didn't care about the praise. She had seen a system that was illogical, a clock that didn't tell time, and she had corrected it. The social fallout was irrelevant to her. Clarissa, observing the scene with a glass of Chardonnay in hand, decided this was the perfect moment to offer her own brand of poison. She leaned across the table, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. She told Martha that she had heard of a wonderful new center downtown. It was a vocational program for special needs teenagers. They taught them how to make pottery. Clarissa suggested that Martha look into it immediately. She said it would be good for Lily to learn how to make bowls or ashtrays, something simple that didn't require too much thinking. It would give her a sense of purpose. Clarissa argued, since she obviously wasn't cut out for academics like Preston. Martha gripped her knife so hard her hand shook. The suggestion was clear. Lily was destined for a life of supervised, menial labor, while Preston was destined for the stars. But the reality of Preston's brilliance was far more fragile than anyone at that table suspected. Later that evening, while the adults were in the parlor discussing politics, Martha went to look for Lily. She found her in the library. A massive room filled with books that no one in the house read anymore, but Lily wasn't alone. Preston was there. Martha stopped in the shadow of the doorway. Preston was not bullying Lily, at least not in the physical sense. He was sitting next to her, a desperate look on his face. Spread out before them were sheets of advanced calculus homework, the kind of math that belonged in a university lecture hall, not a middle school. Preston was pleading. He whispered that he didn't understand any of it. He said if he didn't get an A on this assignment, his GPA would drop, and grandfather would take away his summer trip to Europe. He pushed the papers toward Lily. He made her a promise. If she did the equations for him, he would make sure the cousins left her alone at the next holiday gathering. He would tell them to back off. It was a transaction. Protection for intellect. Lily didn't look at him with contempt. She looked at the math. To her, the equations were beautiful, unlike the boy. She picked up the pencil. She didn't need a calculator. She wrote the answers rapidly, her hand moving in a blur. She solved complex derivatives in seconds, correcting errors in the textbook's own phrasing as she went. Martha stepped forward, ready to expose the charade. She wanted to march into the parlor and show her father that his golden boy was a fraud and that the slow child was the true genius. Lily looked up and saw her mother. She stopped writing. For a second, their eyes locked. Lily gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She put a finger to her lips. Martha froze. She realized in that moment that Lily understood the dynamics of this family better than she did. Lily knew that exposing Preston wouldn't make them love her. It would only make them hate her more for humiliating their heir. Lily chose peace. She chose to be the invisible engine that kept Preston's reputation running, just so she could be left alone to exist in her own mind. Martha stepped back into the shadows, tears stinging her eyes. It was a heartbreak she hadn't expected. The realization that her daughter had learned to survive by hiding her light. The final blow came at the end of the night. Arthur and his wife called Martha and Clarissa into the study for a formal announcement. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of leather and expensive cigars. Arthur sat behind his desk, looking every inch the patriarch. He announced that in honor of the upcoming 45th wedding anniversary, he and their mother were establishing the Ashford Legacy Fund. It was a trust containing $5 million. Martha felt a flicker of hope. $5 million. Even a fraction of that would secure Lily's future. It would mean the best therapies, the best technology, a life where Lily would never have to rely on anyone. Arthur continued. The fund, he explained, was to ensure the future success of the Ashford name. Therefore, the beneficiaries were to be strictly defined. The money would be divided among the grandchildren who showed the potential to carry on the family's public standing. He looked at Clarissa and smiled. He said Preston was obviously the primary beneficiary. Then he looked at Martha. His face went blank. He said that, unfortunately, due to Lily's condition and her lack of integration into society, they had decided it would be irresponsible to include her in the trust. They feared she would be taken advantage of, or that the money would be wasted on frivolous treatments that led nowhere. Instead, they had set aside a small, separate stipend, $500 a month. It was an allowance, not an inheritance. It was barely enough to cover groceries. Martha stared at her parents. The cruelty was breathtaking. It wasn't about the money. They had enough money to support 10 generations. This was a statement. They were writing Lily out of the future. They were erasing her. By denying her the inheritance, they were legally declaring that she was not a true Ashford. Clarissa reached over and patted Martha's hand. Her face arranged in a mask of tragic understanding. She said it was probably for the best, that money would only confuse a girl like Lily. Martha stood up. Her legs felt weak, but her voice was steady. She thanked them for the dinner. She did not argue. She did not beg. She knew now that there was no reasoning with these people. They saw only what they wanted to see, a golden boy who was actually a fraud, and a broken girl who was actually a masterpiece. She walked out of the study, collected Lily from the library, and drove away from the estate. As they drove through the iron gates, the silence in the car was heavy. But then, Lily reached over and turned on the radio. She twisted the dial until she found a station playing classical music. Bach, mathematically precise and complex. She began to tap her fingers on her knee in time with the counterpoint. She looked at her mother and, for the first time in weeks, she spoke. She said the clock had a beat frequency of 0.5 hertz. She said it was soothing. Martha reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand. She realized then that they didn't need the Ashford Legacy Fund. They didn't need the approval of a man who couldn't hear a ticking clock. They were on their own. And for the first time, Martha felt a fire kindling in her chest. It was the fire of a mother who was done asking for permission to exist. If the world wouldn't give Lily a place at the table, Martha would build a new table, and she would burn the old one to the ground if she had to. The apartment was small, but Lily's room was a universe unto itself. To the untrained eye, it looked less like a bedroom and more like the aftermath of an explosion in an electronics factory. The floor was a labyrinth of motherboards, cooling fans, and tangled nests of copper wire. The air always smelled faintly of ozone and heated solder. Most of the equipment had been scavenged from local scrapyards or bought in bulk from online auctions where broken servers were sold by the pound. Martha did not understand the chaos, but she respected it. She saw the way Lily moved through the clutter, stepping over towers of hard drives with the grace of a dancer. To Lily, this was not a mess. It was an inventory. Every capacitor and resistor had a potential purpose, waiting for the right circuit to call it home. At the center of this technological storm sat Lily, bathed in the cool blue glow of 3 monitors she had repaired herself in the physical world. She was the silent, awkward granddaughter of the Ashford dynasty. But in the digital ether, she was a god. She went by the handle Silent C0D on forums like GitHub and Stack Overflow. The name was whispered with a reverence usually reserved for founding fathers of the Internet. Developers from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen debated who Silent C0D actually was. The prevailing theories were that the handle belonged to a rogue artificial intelligence, or perhaps a collective of senior engineers at a top-tier defense contractor. No one suspected it was a 12-year-old girl sitting in a drafty apartment, wearing oversized pajamas and eating dry cereal. Her current obsession was a project she had titled Protocol Zero. It was an ambition that would have made seasoned computer scientists laugh in disbelief. Lily was writing a quantum data compression algorithm. The internet was drowning in data, servers were overheating, and energy consumption was skyrocketing. Lily's code was designed to fold data upon itself, using a multidimensional mathematical structure that reduced file sizes by 90% without losing a single bit of fidelity. It was elegant, it was impossible, and she was 80% finished. Martha knew her daughter was clever with computers. She had seen Lily fix the toaster and reprogram the thermostat, but Martha's understanding of technology was limited to spreadsheets and email. She assumed Lily was building complex video games, or perhaps designing websites. She had no idea that the lines of code cascading down Lily's screens were worth billions of dollars. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Martha had to work a double shift at Blue Crate Logistics. It was the peak of the shipping season, and the office was a madhouse, since she couldn't afford a babysitter and didn't trust leaving Lily alone for 12 hours. She brought her to the office. Lily sat in a quiet corner of the dispatch room, wearing her noise-canceling headphones, her face illuminated by the screen of her battered laptop. Around 2 in the afternoon, the atmosphere in the office shifted from busy to hysterical. The dispatch screens, usually a waterfall of delivery routes and tracking numbers, suddenly froze. Then, they turned a menacing, solid red. A skull and crossbones made of ASCII characters appeared on every monitor in the building, followed by a countdown timer. The operations manager, a sweating man named Gary, ran out of his office screaming that the system was locked. The trucks were stranded at the docks. The warehouse scanners stopped working. Blue Crate Logistics, a company that moved freight worth $2 million a day, had been paralyzed. It was a ransomware attack. The small IT team at Blue Crate was overwhelmed immediately. They were good at resetting passwords and unjamming printers, not fighting off a sophisticated cyber siege. The head of IT, a young man named David who spent more time on his hair than his coding, was frantically typing commands that were being rejected by the system. He shouted that the firewall had been incinerated and that the hackers were demanding $50,000 in cryptocurrency within an hour, or they would delete the entire shipping database. Panic was a physical weight in the room. Martha stood by her desk, clutching a clipboard, watching her colleagues crumble. She knew what this meant. If the company went under, or if they lost days of revenue, layoffs would follow. She could not afford to lose this job. In the corner, Lily looked up. She slid one cup of her headphones off her ear. She heard the panic. She saw the red screens. To her, it wasn't a catastrophe. It was a logic puzzle. A very loud, very rude logic puzzle that was disrupting her mother's cortisol levels. Lily didn't ask for permission. She simply closed her own project and opened a terminal window on her laptop. She didn't need to be plugged into the main server physically. She had mapped the office Wi-Fi network weeks ago out of boredom. Her fingers began to fly. Martha watched her daughter. She saw a focus in Lily's eyes that was terrifying in its intensity. Lily wasn't looking at the red skull. She was looking at the code beneath it. She saw the back door the hackers had used, a lazy vulnerability in the email server that David had forgotten to patch 3 months ago. Lily didn't just block the attack. She hunted. She wrote a script in Python, weaving it with a tracer program she had designed for fun. She injected it into the company network. It acted like a digital antibody, seeking out the intruder's connection. She found the encryption key the hackers were using to hold the data hostage. It was a complex key, but it was based on a prime number sequence that Lily found derivative and boring. She cracked it in 4 minutes. Then, she reversed the flow. She sent a packet of data back up the connection the hackers were using. It wasn't a virus. It was a beacon. It pinged their location, bypassing their VPNs and proxy servers by exploiting a flaw in the routing protocol itself. 12 minutes after the screens had turned red, they flickered, the skull vanished. The familiar blue and white interface of the Blue Crate logistics software reappeared. The printer's whirred back to life. In the corner, Lily pressed the enter key one last time. A small window popped up on her screen with a set of GPS coordinates and an IP address located in a basement in Eastern Europe. She saved the file, put her headphones back on, and reopened her compression project. The silence in the office was deafening. David, the IT manager, was staring at his monitor with his mouth open. He looked at the log files. He saw the intrusion, the fix, and the counterstrike. It had happened so fast that his brain couldn't process it. The command lines were signed with a digital signature he didn't recognize, but the source MAC address was local. He traced it. He turned slowly and looked at the corner of the room. He walked over to where Lily was sitting. Martha intercepted him, her motherly instinct flaring like a shield. She stepped between David and Lily. David pointed a shaking finger at the girl. He asked Martha if she had any idea what her daughter had just done. He said that the code he was looking at was not possible. He said she had just outmaneuvered a professional hacking syndicate in less than 15 minutes using a laptop that looked like it belonged in a museum. Martha, terrified that Lily was in trouble, lied. She said Lily was just playing a game. She said Lily often pretended to type when she was bored. She begged David not to make a fuss, fearing that if the Ashford family found out Lily was involved in anything strange, it would be another reason for them to mock her. David didn't believe her, but he was too shocked to argue. He went back to his office to call the police with the IP address Lily had found, but someone else had been watching. Dr. Eris Thorne was not an employee of Blue Crate. He was an external consultant, a man who charged $500 an hour to advise companies on high-level security architecture. He was also a former professor at MIT, a man who had written the textbooks that David had failed to read. He had been visiting the office that day for a routine audit and had watched the entire event unfold from the server room. He hadn't watched the screens. He had watched the packet traffic. He had seen the elegance of the counterstrike. It wasn't just effective, it was beautiful. It was minimal, brutal, and artistic. It had a fingerprint, a distinctive style of coding that prioritized efficiency over everything else. He recognized the syntax. He had seen similar snippets of code on a niche cryptography forum he frequented, posted by a user named SilentC0DE. Dr. Thorne was a man who had spent 40 years looking for geniuses. He had taught Turing Award winners. He had never seen anything like this. He did not approach Lily at the office. He waited. 2 days later, he found Martha's contact information in the personnel files. He called her personal cell phone, not the office line. When Martha answered, expecting a bill collector, she heard a voice that was gravelly and serious. Doctor. Thorne introduced himself. He didn't mince words. He told her that he knew who had saved the company. He told her that he needed to meet Lily. Martha tried to deny it again. She said her daughter had learning disabilities, that she was nonverbal and couldn't possibly be a hacker. Doctor. Thorne interrupted her. He said that Beethoven was deaf, and yet he wrote the Ninth Symphony. He said that language was not limited to the tongue. He asked Martha to trust him. He wasn't interested in exposing her. He was interested in understanding her. Reluctantly, Martha agreed. She invited him to the apartment on a rainy Thursday evening. Doctor, Thorne was a tall man with a shock of white hair and a suit that had seen better days. He entered the small apartment and looked around. When he saw Lily's room, he didn't recoil at the mess. He smiled. He recognized the habitat of a pure mind. Lily was sitting on the floor, stripping wires from a broken microwave. She didn't look up when he entered. Doctor? Thorne sat on the floor across from her. He didn't try to make small talk. He didn't speak to her like a child. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a laptop. He opened it and turned the screen toward her. On the screen was a problem. It was a cryptographic knot, a mathematical paradox that his team at the university had been trying to untangle for 6 months. It was a theoretical wall that prevented the next generation of encryption from working. He didn't give her instructions. He simply placed the laptop on the floor and waited. Martha stood in the doorway, holding her breath. She expected Lily to ignore him or to retreat into herself as she did with the Ashfords. Lily looked at the screen. She tilted her head. She reached out and pulled the laptop closer. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a second, and then she began to type. She didn't solve the problem the way Thorne expected. She didn't try to untie the knot. She proved that the knot didn't exist. She rewrote the base assumption of the equation, bypassing the paradox entirely. It took her 3 minutes. She pushed the laptop back toward him and went back to her microwave wires. Doctor? Thorne stared at the screen. His hands were trembling. He read the code she had written. It was efficient, cold, and perfect. It was a leap of logic that skipped 10 years of academic theory. He closed the laptop slowly. He stood up, his knees cracking. He turned to Martha. There were tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming awe. Martha asked him, her voice whispering with fear. If Lily was a genius, she wanted to know if her daughter was smart enough to survive in the world. Doctor. Thorne looked at Martha and shook his head. He told her that the word genius was too small. He said that genius implies someone who plays by the rules better than anyone else. He gestured to the girl on the floor, who was humming softly to herself, lost in her own frequency. He told Martha that Lily was not playing the game. She was rewriting it. He said that what he had just seen was not merely intelligence, it was a paradigm shift. He looked Martha in the eye and delivered the verdict that would define the rest of their lives. He said, Martha, your daughter is not a genius. She is a revolution. The weeks that followed the incident at Blue Crate Logistics were defined by a silence that was heavy with secrets. 2 parallel worlds were spinning within the orbit of the Ashford family, moving in opposite directions, destined for a collision that only one of them saw coming. In the manicured suburb where Clarissa lived, the air was thick with panic. Her son, Preston, was crumbling to the outside observer. He was the golden prince of the family, a boy destined for greatness. But behind the closed door of his bedroom, which smelled of expensive cologne and stale energy drinks, Preston was drowning. The pressure came from his mother. Clarissa had set her sights on the Young Leaders Summit, a prestigious summer program that was essentially a feeding ground for the Ivy League. Acceptance into the program was not just a goal. In Clarissa's mind, it was a birthright. She hovered over Preston like a hawk, demanding drafts of his application essay, demanding to see his grade reports, demanding that he embody the excellence she had promised her father he possessed. But Preston was empty. He sat at his custom-built mahogany desk, staring at a blank document on his screen. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from TikTok and Instagram. He was addicted to the dopamine hit of likes and shares, a digital realm where he could curate a version of himself that was cool and carefree in the real world. However, he was failing. He had spent the last semester copying homework from the smart kids in his class and bullying the scholarship students into letting him peek at their exam papers. He didn't know how to write an essay on geopolitical economics. He barely understood the headlines. So, he did what he had been taught to do by observation. He outsourced it. He found a service online, a ghostwriting agency that catered to the children of the wealthy who were too busy or too lazy to do their own work. For $300, a struggling graduate student in another state wrote a passionate, eloquent essay about the importance of ethical leadership in the 21st century. Preston didn't even read it all the way through before he slapped his name on it and sent it to the printer. However, the cracks were starting to show in other places. 3 days later, Clarissa was summoned to the headmaster's office at Preston's private academy. The office was a sanctuary of leather and old books, usually a place where she felt comfortable. Today, however, the atmosphere was frigid. The headmaster, a man named Mr. Henderson, who usually greeted her with a deferential bow, pushed a folder across the desk. Inside were 2 papers. One was a history assignment Preston had submitted. The other was an article published in an academic journal 5 years prior. The text was identical. Mr. Henderson explained, his voice tight with disappointment, that this was a clear case of plagiarism. He stated that under the school's honor code, this resulted in immediate suspension and a permanent mark on the student's academic record. Clarissa did not gasp. She did not look shocked. She did not apologize for her son. She simply crossed her legs and adjusted the silk scarf around her neck. She looked at the headmaster with eyes that were cold and calculating. She reminded him that the Ashford family had just pledged a donation for the new science wing. She mentioned that her father, Arthur Ashford, was currently reviewing the finalization of that check. She spoke softly, but the threat was as loud as a gunshot. She told Mr. Henderson that mistakes happened. She suggested that perhaps Preston had simply forgotten to cite his sources in his enthusiasm. She proposed a solution. Preston would redo the assignment under supervision, and the official record would remain spotless. In exchange, the check for the science wing would be cleared by Monday morning. Mr. Henderson looked at the folder. He looked at the checkbook in his mind. He was a man of education, but he was also a man who needed to keep the lights on. He swallowed his integrity and nodded. The record disappeared. The lie was preserved. Clarissa walked out of the office, her heels clicking a rhythm of victory, not realizing she was paving the road to her son's destruction. Miles away, in the cramped apartment that smelled of soldering iron and rain, a different kind of struggle was taking place. Dr. Aris Thorne sat on a folding chair in Lily's room. He was holding a brochure for the MIT Future Innovators program. It was a competition for brilliant young minds between the ages of 12 and 16. The winners were granted mentorships, scholarships, and most importantly, a platform to present their work to the leaders of the global tech industry. Lily sat on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was shaking her head vigorously. She signed to her mother, her hands moving in sharp, agitated jerks. Martha translated for the professor. Lily said she could not do it. She said they would laugh at her. She said she was the broken girl, the one who couldn't speak, the one her grandfather called a retard. She was terrified of the spotlight. In the shadows of the internet, as Silent C0D, she was powerful. In the light, she felt naked and defective. Doctor. Thorne leaned forward. He didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He spoke to her as a peer. He told her that he had read her code for the quantum compression algorithm. He told her it was poetry. He said that the world was full of people who could talk, politicians, salesmen, liars like her cousin, but the world was starving for people who could do. Martha knelt beside her daughter. She took Lily's hands, stopping their frantic motion. She looked into Lily's eyes, which were wide with panic. Martha knew this was the moment. If Lily retreated now, she would stay in this room forever. Martha whispered a sentence that she had been holding on to for years. She told Lily that she didn't need to speak. She told her to let the code scream for her. Something in that image shifted the fear in Lily's chest. The idea of her code, her logic, her structure. Having a voice that was louder than her grandfather's shouting gave her a surge of courage. She looked at Dr. Thorne and gave a single, slow nod. The application process was grueling. It required a video presentation, usually. This involved a student standing in front of a camera explaining their project. Lily couldn't do that. So, they improvised. They turned her room into a studio. Lily set up 3 monitors behind her. She wrote a script, but not for her voice. She programmed the monitors to display the data visualization of her algorithm in real time. Martha held the camera. Lily stood in the frame. Dressed in a black hoodie, she didn't open her mouth. Instead, she used American Sign Language. Her movements were precise, rhythmic, and confident. As she signed the concepts, entanglement, compression, latency, the screens behind her exploded with graphics that illustrated her points perfectly. It was a performance art piece of pure mathematics. There was no sound in the video except for the hum of the computer fans and the soft rustle of her clothes. They added subtitles at the bottom of the screen, translating her signs and the complex equations. It was haunting. It was different. It was undeniably brilliant. They hit the submit button at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Lily immediately curled up under her blanket, exhausted, but Martha saw a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was hope. 2 weeks later, the Ashfords held another family dinner. It was a smaller affair, just the immediate family, but the tension was as high as ever. They sat in the dining room, the crystal chandelier casting a fracturing light over the table. Preston was the center of attention again. He had brought the ghost-written essay to show his grandfather. Arthur Ashford put on his reading glasses. He read the essay aloud, his voice booming with pride. He lingered on phrases like the burden of legacy and moral fortitude. He looked up at Preston, who was busy trying to hide his phone under the table. Arthur slammed his hand on the table in delight. He declared that this was what he had been talking about. He said this was the Ashford intellect. He told Preston that he was a true heir, someone who understood the weight of his name. He said he would personally send this essay to his contacts at the governor's office. Preston smiled, a thin, sickly thing. He said thank you. He didn't look at the paper. He knew that if asked to define moral fortitude, he wouldn't be able to do it. But it didn't matter. The lie was working. Clarissa beamed, sipping her wine. She glanced at Martha and Lily. Her look was one of pitying triumph. She asked Martha how the homeschooling was going. She asked if Lily had managed to learn her colors yet. Martha gripped her fork. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the wine in Clarissa's face and tell her that her son was a fraud and that Lily was currently waiting to hear back from the most prestigious technology institute in the world. But she didn't. She remembered Lily's signal. She remembered the long game. She simply smiled and said they were making progress. The vindication came 3 days later. But it came in silence. Martha was at work when her phone pinged. It was an email notification. The subject line read, MIT, Future Innovators, Preliminary Round Results. Her hands shook so badly, she almost dropped the phone. She opened the email. Dear applicant, we are astounded by your submission. The committee has unanimously voted to advance your project. Protocol 0, to the finalist round. We have never seen an application of this nature. We look forward to seeing you at the showcase. Martha had to run to the bathroom to cry. She sobbed into a paper towel, letting out years of fear and frustration. Her daughter, the error, the mistake, the glitch, was a finalist. She didn't tell anyone, not even her parents, especially not her parents. She went home and showed Lily the email. Lily read it twice. She didn't smile. She went to her whiteboard and wrote a single word, valid. But the universe has a way of balancing joy with cruelty. The next day, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. It was the formal invitation to the Ashford Legacy Fund's 45th anniversary gala. It was embossed with gold leaf. Inside, there was a card detailing the black tie dress code and the schedule of speeches. Tucked behind the RSVP card was a handwritten note on personal stationery. It was from Martha's mother. The script was elegant and spidery. It read, Martha, we expect you to attend, as appearances are important. However, regarding the child, If you must bring her, please ensure she is medicated or controlled. We will have important guests, including the senator. Do not let her embarrass us. If she makes a scene, or if she starts with those twitchy hand movements, remove her immediately. This is Preston's night to shine. Do not ruin it." Martha stared at the note. She felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in her gut. They wanted Preston to shine. They wanted to hide Lily in the dark. She walked over to the desk where the MIT acceptance email was printed out. She placed the cruel note next to it. The contrast was stark. One piece of paper tried to erase her daughter. The other tried to elevate her. Martha picked up a pen on the RSVP card. She checked the box that said, "Attending." She looked at Lily, who was busy coding the next phase of her presentation. Martha vowed that they would attend. Oh yes, they would attend. But they wouldn't be sitting in the corner. They were going to walk into that lion's den. And they were bringing the future with them. The Ashfords wanted a show. Lily was going to give them one they would never forget. The week leading up to the 45th anniversary gala was not a countdown to a celebration. It was a slow march toward an execution. The air in the city felt heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm, mirroring the pressure building inside Martha's chest. She knew that once the candles were blown out on the anniversary cake, the cement would dry on her parents' will, sealing Lily's fate as a footnote in the Ashford history. Martha decided to make one final, desperate attempt to breach the fortress of her parents' prejudice. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the party, she drove to the estate. She did not bring Lily inside. She left her in the car with her laptop and a bag of pretzels, cracking the window for air, shielding her daughter from the toxicity that permeated the very drywall of the manor. Martha walked into the drawing room armed with a magazine. It was a niche publication. Wired World, but it was respected. On page 42, there was a small sidebar article discussing the mysterious coder known as Silent C0DE. The article speculated that this anonymous figure might be the next great architect of the digital age. It didn't mention Lily's name. No one knew it yet, but Martha knew. She held the magazine like a shield as she approached her mother, who was arranging white lilies in a crystal vase. Martha opened the magazine and placed it on the table. She pointed to the paragraph. Her voice trembled slightly as she explained that this was Lily. She told her mother that people in Silicon Valley were talking about her. She tried to convey that Lily wasn't just playing games. She was building infrastructure. Her mother didn't even put down her shears. She glanced at the glossy page with a look of mild distaste, as if Martha had placed a dirty napkin on the table. She sniffed and said that anyone could be famous on the internet. She called it a playground for liars and introverts who couldn't handle the real world. She dismissed the article as virtual nonsense, implying that if it didn't happen in a boardroom or a country club, it didn't hold any real value. To her, success was something you could touch, like a building or a horse. Code was invisible, and therefore worthless. Then, Arthur Ashford entered the room. He was wearing his smoking jacket, looking every inch the master of his domain. He saw the magazine and swept it aside with the back of his hand. He told Martha to sit down. He said they needed to stop dancing around the issue and settle the financial arrangements once and for all. He pulled a leather folder from his desk. He opened it and laid out the terms of the new family trust. His voice was devoid of emotion, factual and cold, as if he were discussing the liquidation of a failing subsidiary rather than the future of his granddaughter. He stated that the Ashford Legacy Fund, totaling $5 million, would be transferred 100% to Preston upon his 18th birthday. Preston, he argued, had the social standing, the charisma, and the Ashford spirit to utilize that capital to expand the family's political influence. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. She asked about Lily. Arthur nodded, as if he had anticipated the question. He said that Lily would not be left on the street. They had arranged for a monthly stipend. It was enough to cover rent in a modest neighborhood and basic groceries. However, there was a condition that made the air in the room turn poisonous. He slid a document across the polished mahogany table. It was a legal petition for guardianship. Arthur explained that in order to secure this stipend and to protect the family assets from being squandered, the money would not go to Lily directly, nor to Martha. It would be placed in a special needs trust managed by a court-appointed executor. But to activate this trust, Martha had to sign the document in front of her. Martha looked at the paper. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear. The document required her to formally attest that Lily Ashford was permanently intellectually disabled and lacking the capacity for independent adult function. It was a declaration of incompetence. It was a legal branding iron that would strip Lily of her rights, her autonomy, and her dignity forever. Martha pushed the paper back. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so hot it felt like it was burning her throat. She refused. She told her father that she would never sign that. She told him that Lily was smarter than everyone in this room combined. She told him that signing that paper would be a lie. The argument that followed was the loudest sound the house had heard in years. Arthur stood up, his face reddening. He slammed his hand on the desk. He shouted at Martha to stop being delusional. He told her to look at reality. He listed Lily's failures, her lack of eye contact, her silence, her refusal to conform to social norms. He leaned over the desk, his eyes bulging, and delivered the sentence that would shatter the last remnant of Martha's filial piety. He screamed that Martha needed to stop pretending. He said, "She is broken. Martha, she is the mistake. She is the dumb one. Accept it." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The dumb one. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Martha spun around. The heavy oak door to the drawing room was slightly ajar. Standing there, framed by the shadows of the hallway, was Lily. She had come in from the car, likely looking for a bathroom or simply bored. She had heard everything. Martha's heart broke. She expected to see tears. She expected to see Lily crumble, to cover her ears, to rock back and forth as she did when she was overwhelmed. Martha took a step toward her, ready to shield her, to apologize, to take her away. But Lily was not crying. She stood perfectly still. Her face was not contorted in sorrow. It was a mask of terrifying neutrality. Her eyes, usually darting around the room absorbing details, were locked onto her grandfather. They were cold. They were hard. It was the look of a scientist observing a particularly nasty virus under a microscope. There was no hurt in that gaze, only a sudden, icy resolution. Lily looked at the man who had just called her the dumb one, and she didn't see a grandfather. She saw an obsolete operating system that needed to be uninstalled. She turned around and walked out the front door without making a sound. The drive home was silent. Martha tried to speak, to offer comfort, but the words felt ash-gray in her mouth. She glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror. Lily wasn't looking out the window. She was typing on her phone. Her thumbs moved with a blurring speed. She wasn't playing a game. She was composing a message. The message was sent to a secure server in Boston. It was addressed to Dr. Eris Thorne. It contained only 2 words. Execute, now. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety. The gala was looming. Martha felt like a soldier walking into an ambush with no ammunition. To make matters worse, Clarissa called the night before the party. Her sister's voice was bright and chirpy, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately cruel. Clarissa said she had heard about the little disagreement with Dad. She told Martha not to be stubborn. She said that signing the papers was really for the best. Then, she dropped the final insult. She suggested that once Preston turned 18 and inherited the main fund, he could perhaps take over the management of Lily's little trust. She said it would be good practice for him to look after his unfortunate cousin. Martha gripped the phone so tight the plastic creaked. The idea of Preston, the boy who paid for his essays, the boy who cheated his way through math class, controlling Lily's life was so grotesque it made Martha physically nauseous. She hung up without saying goodbye. Then came the morning of the party. It was a Saturday. The sky was a bruised purple. threatening rain. Martha was in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold coffee, wondering if she should just fake an illness and stay home. She didn't have the strength to watch her father toast Preston's stolen brilliance. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't a casual knock. It was the sharp, authoritative rap of a courier. Martha opened the door. A delivery man in a brown uniform handed her a thick, rigid envelope. It was marked Priority Overnight. The return address was typed in bold. Simple font. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Office of Admissions and Innovation. Martha took the package. It felt heavy, heavier than paper should feel. She carried it to the kitchen table. Lily came out of her room, wearing her pajamas, her hair a mess. She stopped when she saw the envelope. She knew what it was. She nodded at her mother to open it. Martha tore the strip off the top of the envelope. Inside, there was a folder made of thick, expensive cardstock. She opened it. The first thing she saw was a letter signed by the Dean of the School of Engineering. But it wasn't just a letter of acceptance. It was an invitation. "Dear Miss Ashford," it began, "your submission, Protocol 0, has been peer-reviewed by our faculty. We believe this is not merely a student project, but a foundational shift in data architecture." Martha scanned down the page. Her eyes widened. Her breath hitched in her throat. "We are pleased to inform you that you have won the Future Innovators Grand Prize. Furthermore, we would like to offer you a full scholarship to our accelerated program, pending your legal guardian's consent. But more immediately, we have arranged for a patent review. The estimated initial valuation of your algorithm, should you choose to license it, is projected to be—" Martha stopped. She read the number. She read it again. She traced the zeros with her finger to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. It was a number that made the Ashford Legacy Fund look like pocket change. Beneath the letter was a sleek, metallic badge. It was the keynote speaker pass for the upcoming Tech Summit in Boston. Martha looked up from the paper. The kitchen, with its peeling paint and dripping faucet, suddenly felt different. It was no longer a cage. It was a launch pad. She looked at Lily. The girl was standing by the refrigerator, eating a dry piece of toast. She looked back at her mother. And for the first time in weeks, the corners of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of victory. It was the smile of a chess player who had just seen mate in 3 moves. Martha felt a transformation take place in her own soul. The fear that had paralyzed her for 7 years, the fear of her parents, the fear of poverty, the fear of judgment, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp steel. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She placed the envelope in her purse. She didn't need a lawyer. She didn't need a trust fund. She held the nuclear codes in her handbag. She stood up and smoothed her hair. She looked at her daughter, her eyes shining with a fierce predatory light. "Lily," she said, her voice steady and low, "go to your room." Lily tilted her head, questioning. Martha smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Put on the blue dress," Martha said. "Fix your hair, and wear your headphones if you want. I don't care." She walked to the window and looked out at the gray sky, imagining the chandeliers and the champagne waiting for them at the Ashford estate. "Tonight," Martha whispered to the glass, "we are not going to a party. Tonight, we are going hunting." The driveway of the Ashford estate was transformed into a glittering river of steel and chrome. Black limousines and vintage sports cars idled in a line that stretched down the hill, depositing the city's elite onto the red carpet that had been rolled out over the marble steps. It was a masquerade of power disguised as a birthday party. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, Cuban cigars, and the metallic tang of ambition. Inside, the grand ballroom was a spectacle of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a fractured, diamond-like light over the crowd. The walls were draped in velvet the color of dried blood, and fresh white orchids were arranged in towering sculptures on every table. A string quartet played in the corner, the music polite and unobtrusive, designed to fill the silence between business deals and political maneuvering. The guests were a curated collection of influence. There was the state senator, holding a scotch and laughing too loudly at a joke he didn't understand. There were CEOs of pharmaceutical companies, real estate moguls who owned half the skyline, and headmasters of private schools who sold grades for donations. They moved in tight circles, clinking glasses of champagne that cost $300 a bottle, their smiles tight and practiced. They were predators in tuxedos and silk gowns, gathered to pay homage to the alpha of the pack. At the center of it all stood Arthur and Victoria Ashford. They were the monarchs of this kingdom, holding court near the ice sculpture that had been carved into the shape of the family crest. Arthur looked impeccable in a bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair combed back, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who believes he owns the world. Victoria stood beside him, draped in diamonds that caught the light and threw it back with a cold fire. She smiled at the guests, but her eyes were scanning the room, checking for flaws, for dust, for anything that might crack the perfect porcelain surface of their image. Martha sat at a table near the back, in the shadows of a massive pillar. She wore a simple black dress, sharp and elegant, a stark contrast to the flamboyant gowns around her. Beside her sat Lily. Lily was wearing the blue dress. She had headphones around her neck, though she wasn't wearing them over her ears. She was watching the room with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist observing a primitive tribe. She saw the fake smiles. She saw the way the senator's hand shook slightly when he reached for his drink. She saw the geometry of the room, the flow of the crowd, the variables in a chaotic system. To her, this wasn't a party. It was a data set. The music swelled and then faded. The lights dimmed, leaving a single spotlight trained on the raised stage at the front of the room. Arthur Ashford walked into the light. The applause was immediate and thunderous. It was not the applause of affection. It was the applause of obligation. He adjusted the microphone stand. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze passing over Martha and Lily without a flicker of recognition, as if they were empty chairs. He began to speak. His voice was a rich baritone, cultivated for boardrooms and political rallies. He spoke about history. He spoke about the 45 years he and Victoria had spent building the Ashford name, but quickly, the speech pivoted to his favorite subject, genetics. He spoke of the Ashford bloodline as if it were a rare vintage of wine. He used words like pedigree, stock, and superiority. He claimed that success was not a matter of luck, but a matter of biology. The Ashfords, he declared, were bred for leadership. They were the architects of society, the thinkers, the doers. He painted a picture of a genetic dynasty that was destined to rule, ignoring the fact that his own fortune had been saved multiple times by government bailouts and tax loopholes. The crowd nodded along, mesmerized by the rhetoric of exceptionalism. It made them feel good to believe that their wealth was a biological imperative rather than a byproduct of circumstance. Then, Arthur smiled, a shark baring its teeth. He gestured to the side of the stage. He announced that the future of this great lineage was secure. He introduced the carrier of the torch, the proof of the Ashford genius, Clarissa, standing in the front row, shoved Preston forward. The boy stumbled slightly as he walked up the stairs. He was wearing a suit that was identical to his grandfather's, making him look like a miniaturized, terrified clone. He was sweating. His eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. But there was no exit. There was only the microphone and the expectation of perfection. Preston pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were shaking so visibly that the paper rattled against the microphone. He began to read. The speech was a masterpiece of hollowness. It was filled with buzzwords that meant nothing. He spoke of synergistic responsibility and the moral imperative of fiscal dominance. He used 3-syllable words where one would do. He talked about his passion for debate, his love of history, and his vision for a future led by the intellectual elite. It was a lie. Every word of it had been written by a 40-year-old copywriter 2 states away. Preston didn't know what fiscal dominance meant. He barely passed pre-algebra, but he read the words with the desperate cadence of a hostage reading a ransom note. When he finished, he looked up, terrified. The room erupted. The senator stood up and clapped. The CEOs nodded in approval. They didn't hear a scared boy. They heard what they wanted to hear. They heard the echo of their own egos. They saw a mirror reflecting their own self-importance. Clarissa was beaming. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the other mothers, her expression screaming victory. See? My son, the heir, the golden child. Arthur walked back to the microphone and placed a heavy hand on Preston's shoulder. He looked at the boy with a pride that was entirely conditional. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The reason for the gathering. Arthur cleared his throat. The room went silent. He announced that in honor of this anniversary, and to ensure the longevity of their empire, they had made a decision regarding the Ashford Legacy Fund. He paused for effect. He declared, in a voice that reached every corner of the hall, that the entirety of the $5 million trust, 100% of the assets, the stocks, and the properties, would be placed under the sole management and ownership of Preston Ashford upon his 18th birthday. He called Preston the only one with the intellect, the character, and the strength to carry the burden of their wealth. He called him the true future. The applause was deafening. Champagne glasses were raised. Preston looked faint, but he managed a weak smile. But the performance was not over. The cruelty had not yet reached its crescendo. Victoria Ashford stepped up to the microphone. She tapped it with a manicured fingernail. She waited for the applause to die down. She put on a face of tragic benevolence, the kind of expression a saint wears in a Renaissance painting. She said there was one more matter to address. She said that a family as blessed as theirs had a duty to care for the weak. She looked directly at the back of the room. The spotlight followed her gaze, cutting through the darkness and landing squarely on table 19. It illuminated Martha and Lily, blinding them in a harsh circle of white light. Victoria spoke into the silence. She said that everyone knew about the tragedy of their other grandchild. She used the word tragedy with a soft, pitying sigh. She announced that for Lily, the unfortunate child, the one who had been born less than. They had set up a special charitable arrangement. It was a care fund. It was designed to ensure that she would be looked after in a facility for the rest of her life. Victoria's voice dripped with poison wrapped in sugar. She said that they all had to accept that Lily was different. She called her the slow one of the family. She said that while Preston was destined for the Senate, Lily was destined to be a permanent child, a burden that the family would graciously carry because they were such good, moral people. She said it loudly. She said it clearly. The dumb one. She didn't use the exact phrase, but the implication was louder than if she had screamed it. She stripped Lily of her dignity in front of 200 people, reducing a brilliant mind to a charity case to be pitied. The reaction of the room was visceral. A collective awe rippled through the crowd. It was a sound of sympathetic condescension. Women tilted their heads and looked at Lily with sad eyes. Men shook their heads, murmuring about how noble Arthur and Victoria were to take care of a defective child. They looked at Lily, expecting to see a drooling invalid. They saw a girl in a blue dress, sitting perfectly still, her face composed, her eyes dry. Clarissa turned in her seat. She found Martha in the spotlight. She didn't even try to hide her smirk. It was a look of pure, distilled malice. It said, "I won. You lost. Your daughter is nothing." Martha felt the heat of the spotlight on her skin. It felt like a physical weight. For 7 years. This heat had burned her. For 7 years. She had shrunk away from it, apologized for it, tried to hide in the shadows to avoid the burn. But tonight, the heat didn't hurt. It fueled her. She touched her purse. She felt the rigid edge of the envelope from MIT. It was a weapon more powerful than any checkbook, more devastating than any trust fund. She looked at her parents on the stage. She saw them for what they were. They weren't giants. They were small, fearful people clinging to a decaying idea of superiority. They were dinosaurs staring at a meteor and calling it a firework. Martha pushed her chair back. The sound of the chair scraping against the parquet floor was sharp and violent. It cut through the murmurs of the crowd. She stood up. Clarissa's smirk faltered slightly. She expected Martha to run. She expected her to grab Lily and flee the room in tears. Humiliated and broken. That was the script. That was how this was supposed to go. But Martha didn't turn toward the exit. She turned toward the stage. She smoothed the front of her dress. She took a breath, inhaling the scent of lilies and hypocrisy. Then, she began to walk. Her heels struck the floor with a rhythmic, military precision. Click, click, click. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the ballroom. Heads turned. The senator stopped drinking. The waitstaff froze. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for her. Drawn by the magnetic pull of her fury, she walked with her head high. She didn't look at the guests. She kept her eyes locked on her father's face. She saw the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand. Why wasn't she crying? Why wasn't she leaving? She reached the base of the stairs. Preston, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, took a step back. Hiding behind his grandmother, Martha walked up the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. She stood on the platform, sharing the light with the people who had tried to erase her daughter. She stood tall, taller than she had ever stood in her life. She looked at her mother, whose mask of benevolence was cracking into a look of horror. She looked at her father, whose face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. Martha didn't reach for the microphone. She didn't need it yet. Her presence was loud enough. She stood there, a mother who had finished apologizing, ready to burn the masquerade to the ground. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was not the respectful silence of an audience listening to a speech, but the breathless, terrified silence of a crowd watching a tightrope walker lose their balance. Martha stood on the stage, the spotlight reflecting off the unshed tears in her eyes, turning them into hard, glittering diamonds. She was close enough to smell her mother's perfume. A scent of gardenias that had once meant comfort, but now smelled only of decay. Victoria Ashford stared at her daughter. Her mouth was slightly open. Her expertly applied lipstick smudged at the corner. She held the microphone with a white-knuckled grip, as if it were a scepter she was afraid to yield. Martha didn't ask for it. She reached out and placed her hand over her mother's. Her skin was warm, alive, contrasting with Victoria's cold. Clammy fingers, with a gentle but inexorable pressure, she pried the device from her mother's hand. The feedback whined, a high-pitched shriek that made the guests flinch, before settling into a low hum. Martha turned to face the room. She looked at the senator. She looked at the bankers. She looked at the headmasters. She saw them not as the elite, but as a jury. "Thank you," Martha said. Her voice was not loud, but it was amplified by the sound system, filling every corner of the vaulted room. "Thank you, Mother, Father, for that touching tribute. Thank you for your pity." She paused, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "However," she continued, her voice hardening into steel, "I believe there is a fundamental confusion in this room regarding the definition of the word slow." In the front row, Clarissa realized what was happening. Her survival instinct, honed by years of social climbing, kicked in. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over with a loud crash. She lunged toward the stairs, her face twisted in a snarl of panic. She was going to stop this. She was going to drag her sister off the stage by her hair if she had to. Martha didn't flinch. She simply turned her head and locked eyes with Clarissa. It was a look of such concentrated nuclear fury that it physically stopped Clarissa in her tracks. It was the look of a mother wolf standing over her cub. It said, "Take one more step, and I will destroy you." Clarissa froze, 1 foot on the bottom step, paralyzed by the sheer force of Martha's will. Martha turned back to the podium. She reached into her small black clutch and pulled out her smartphone. "You speak of legacy," Martha said to her father, who was standing frozen next to the ice sculpture. You speak of the Ashford intellect. You speak of the truth. Let us look at the truth. She placed the phone on the lectern. With a calm, practiced motion, she plugged the wireless casting dongle into the port. She had set this up hours ago, bribing the audio-visual technician with $50 to give her admin access to the main projector, behind the Ashford grandparents. The massive screen that had just displayed the family crest flickered. The gold lion vanished. In its place, a document appeared. It was projected 10 feet high, crisp and undeniable. The room gasped. A collective intake of breath that sounded like the air being sucked out of the building. It was a screenshot of a software interface. The header read, Turnitin Academic Plagiarism Checker. Below it was the essay Preston had just read, but the text wasn't black. It was a sea of angry, violent red. The sidebar displayed the analysis statistics in bold font. Similarity index, 92%. Original source, Journal of Sociopolitical Economics. Published 2021. Martha pointed at the screen without looking back. "This is the speech you just applauded," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is the Ashford genius you are celebrating. It is 92% stolen. It was written by a doctoral candidate 5 years ago." Preston, standing in the shadows of the stage, let out a small, pathetic whimper. He covered his face with his hands. Arthur Ashford's face went from pale to a deep, vascular purple. He took a step forward, his hands shaking. "Turn it off!" he bellowed. His voice cracked, losing its cultivated baritone. "You are lying. Turn it off immediately. You are insane." Martha ignored him. She swiped her finger across the phone screen. The image changed. The gasps turned into shocked whispers. This was not a document from a stranger. This was an email. The sender's address was clearly visible. Clarissa, Ashford at Ashford Holdings, net. The recipient was Principal, Henderson St., Jude Academy, Edu. The text was magnified, looming over the stage like an indictment from God. Mr. Henderson, regarding the plagiarism flag on Preston's history final, I would hate for this administrative error to impact the timing of the donation for the new science wing. My father is reviewing the check on Monday. I trust the record will be cleaned by then. We expect excellence, and we pay for it. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a reputation dying in real time. The headmaster of St. Jude Academy, who was sitting at table 4, went as white as a sheet. He stood up and began to back away toward the exit, loosening his tie as if he were choking. Clarissa sank back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. The mask had not just slipped, it had been ripped off. Taking the skin with it, Martha looked at her father. He was gripping the podium, breathing hard, looking like a man having a cardiac event. But she wasn't done. She hadn't even started the main course. "You called my daughter a tragedy," Martha said softly. "You called her the dumb one. You prepared a charity fund to hide her away in a facility because she doesn't speak your language." She swiped the screen again. "Let me reintroduce you to Lily Ashford." The screen flashed white. Then, a logo appeared. It was a simple, maroon logo that every person in the room recognized. A lamp and a book, the seal of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Underneath it was a letter. The words early admission were highlighted in yellow. "This," Martha said, her voice rising with the swell of victory, "is a letter inviting Lily to join the MIT Special Talent Program. It is a program reserved for the top 0.1% of young minds in the world. She is not going there to learn. Father, she is going there to teach. The faculty has requested her presence to lead a seminar on quantum data architecture." The senator dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor. But no one looked. Their eyes were glued to the screen. Arthur Ashford stared at the MIT logo. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Lily, who was still sitting at the table, tapping her finger against her cheek, completely unbothered by the chaos. "But intellect is cheap to you, isn't it?" Martha said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You only value things that can be counted. You only value capital. So let's talk about capital. She swiped the screen one last time. The final image was a legal contract. It was dense with text, but the headers were clear. It was a technology transfer agreement between Elsher Ashford, represented by Silent C0DE, and Nebula Systems, one of the largest cloud computing corporations in Silicon Valley. Martha turned to face her parents fully. She pointed to the bottom of the contract, where the numbers were circled. "Last week," Martha announced, her voice ringing out like a bell, "Lily sold the non-exclusive licensing rights to her data compression algorithm. She did this while sitting in her bedroom, using a computer I bought from a pawn shop for $150. She walked closer to her father. "The initial signing bonus," she read aloud, making sure every syllable was heard, "is $2 million. The crowd erupted. People were standing up now. Crane their necks. $2 million. The number rippled through the room. "But that is just the advance," Martha continued, shouting over the noise. "The contract stipulates a royalty fee. Lily will receive 5% of all energy savings generated by this algorithm for the next 20 years. She paused, letting the math sink in. In a room full of businessmen, everyone knew what 5% of a global server farm's energy bill looked like. It looked like a fortune. "The analysts project that the first year of royalties will exceed $4 million, Martha said. "By the time she is 18, she will be worth more than this entire estate." She looked at her mother, who was clutching her diamond necklace as if it were strangling her. "My daughter," Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream, "is 12 years old. In 1 week, she has earned half of the wealth it took you a lifetime to hoard. And she did it without lying. She did it without cheating. She did it without you." Arthur Ashford slumped against the podium. He looked small. He looked old. The narrative he had built his entire life, the story of the superior Ashford genes, had just been dismantled by the very person he had tried to throw away. Martha unplugged her phone. The screen behind them went black, plunging the stage back into shadow. She tossed the microphone onto the podium. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Keep your trust fund," Martha said, looking down at her parents. "Keep your charity. We don't need it. We never did." She turned and walked down the stairs. The crowd parted for her again, but this time, there was no pity in their eyes. There was fear. There was awe. They looked at her as if she were a giant slayer. She walked to the table where Lily was sitting. Lily looked up. She took off her headphones. She looked at her mother, and then she looked at the stunned, silent room. Lily stood up. She smoothed her blue dress. She reached out and took her mother's hand. They walked toward the exit together. The only sound in the room was the click of their heels on the marble floor. As they reached the double doors, Lily stopped. She turned back to look at the stage one last time. She looked at her grandfather, who was staring at her with a look of devastation. Lily raised her hand. She didn't wave. She simply held up 2 fingers in a peace sign, then curled them slightly. It was a casual, dismissive gesture. Then, she turned around, and together with her mother, she walked out into the night, leaving the Ashfords alone in the ruin of their own making. The darkness that followed the extinguishing of the projector screen was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. For a few seconds, the only sound in the ballroom was the hum of the air conditioning, which seemed to be working overtime to cool the sudden, feverish heat of the scandal. Then, there was movement. Lily stood up from table 19. She did not rush. Her movements were deliberate, calibrated, and calm. She walked toward the stage where her mother stood. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the guests who were now staring at her with a mixture of horror and awe. She looked straight ahead, her eyes fixed on a point that seemed to exist beyond the walls of the room. She ascended the stairs. The click of her shoes was the only percussion in the silent symphony of the Ashford family's destruction. She stood next to Martha, a small figure in a blue dress, dwarfed by the grandiosity of the stage but radiating a presence that felt 10 feet tall. Martha placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of protection anymore. It was a gesture of presentation. She was presenting a masterpiece to a room full of people who had only ever looked at the frame. Martha leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You have spent 7 years asking why she doesn't speak," Martha said, looking directly at her mother. "You assumed it was because she couldn't. You assumed her mind was a broken circuit, incapable of processing the complex social nuances of this family." Martha shook her head slightly, a small, pitying smile playing on her lips. "You were wrong. Lily doesn't speak to you because she finds you boring." A ripple of shock went through the room. It was an insult so simple, yet so devastatingly arrogant, that it took the breath away. "She listens," Martha continued. "She hears you talk about money, about status, about who is wearing what, and who is sleeping with whom. And to a mind that contemplates quantum mechanics and multidimensional data structures. Your conversations are static. They are noise." She didn't stay silent because she was afraid. She stayed silent because she determined that nothing you had to say was worth the caloric energy of a response. Arthur Ashford looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth to roar, to demand order, but a voice from the shadows cut him off. "She is entirely correct. Arthur." The crowd turned, emerging from the back of the room, walking past the stunned security guards, was a man in a rumpled tweed suit that looked out of place among the tuxedos. He had a shock of wild white hair and eyes that burned with intelligence. It was Dr. Aris Thorne. He walked up the aisle, ignoring the whispers of the few people who recognized him as a legend in the world of computer science. He didn't ask for permission. He walked straight up the stairs and stood beside Lily. He looked at the Ashfords with deep, academic disappointment. "I am Dr. Aris Thorne," he announced, his voice gravelly and firm without the need for a microphone. "I formerly chaired the Department of Computer Science at MIT. I have spent 40 years hunting for potential. I have taught Turing Award winners. I have mentored billionaires." He placed a hand gently on Lily's head. "In half a century, I have never seen a mind like this. You call her slow. That is a biological impossibility. Her processing speed is so fast that she likely finds standard human communication agonizingly inefficient. She is a data architecture genius. She sees the mathematical skeleton of the world while you are all still staring at the skin." He turned to Arthur, his expression hardening. "You were about to throw a Mozart into a trash can because he wouldn't play a nursery rhyme. It is not just bad parenting. Mr. Ashford, it is a crime against human progress." The weight of his words crushed the last remnants of Arthur's defense. The patriarch shrank back. Leaning heavily against the podium, the narrative was gone, the lie was dead, but the humiliation was not over. Preston, who had been hiding in the shadow of his grandmother, suddenly felt the eyes of the room shift to him. He was the counterweight. If Lily was the genius, then what was he? The software plagiarism report was still burned into everyone's retinas. The fraud was exposed. Clarissa, desperate to salvage the wreckage, grabbed Preston's arm. Her nails dug into his suit jacket. She hissed at him to stand up straight, to look dignified, to deny it. "Tell them!" Clarissa shrieked, her voice cracking, abandoning all pretense of elegance. "Tell them it's a mistake. Tell them you wrote that essay. Tell them you are the leader." The pressure broke him. Preston was 12 years old. He was a child who had been forced to wear a costume that didn't fit for his entire life. He looked at his mother's twisted, desperate face. He looked at his grandfather's terrifying rage. He looked at the room full of strangers judging him. He pulled his arm away from Clarissa violently. "I didn't write it," Preston screamed. The boy's voice was high and thin, filled with tears. He backed away from his mother, shaking his head. "I didn't write any of it. I don't know what fiscal dominance means. I don't know history." He pointed a shaking finger at Lily. "She did it. She did the math homework, the calculus, the thing with the variables. I asked her to do it because I was going to fail. I'm not smart. I just wanted to play video games." The confession hung in the air, raw and pathetic. Clarissa froze. Her mouth was open, a silent scream dying in her throat. Her own son had just delivered the fatal blow. The golden boy was not just a fraud, he was a parasite, feeding off the very cousin she had spent years mocking. The guests began to murmur. The sound grew louder, a buzzing hive of judgment. They weren't looking at Preston with anger. They were looking at him with pity. But they were looking at Clarissa and the grandparents with unmasked disgust. Victoria Ashford was trembling. Her hands shook so bad that the diamonds on her fingers rattled against the microphone stand. She looked down at the paper in her hand, the MIT letter that she had unknowingly mocked just minutes ago. She looked at Lily. For the first time in 12 years, she actually looked at her granddaughter. She saw the intelligence in her eyes. She saw the resemblance to Martha. She saw the waste. "I?" Victoria stammered, her voice a ghost of its former imperious self. "I didn't know. Lily, I didn't know." It was a weak, pathetic excuse. Lily didn't speak. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a tablet. It was a rugged, custom-built device, one of her many projects. She tapped the screen. Her fingers moved with that familiar, blurring speed. She typed for 5 seconds. Then, she held the tablet up to the microphone. She pressed a button. A synthesized voice echoed through the ballroom. It was a cold, robotic voice, devoid of inflection, which made the words cut even deeper. "You did not know because you did not look." The voice paused. Lily typed again. "I do not need your money. Keep your trust fund. Keep your charity." She looked at her grandfather, her eyes locking onto his. She pressed the button again. "I am smarter than all of you combined. My code will run the world while you are still arguing about who owns it." The robotic voice faded, leaving a silence that felt like the aftermath of a bomb blast. Martha stepped forward. She took the tablet from Lily and held her daughter's hand. She looked at her parents, who were now huddled together on the stage, looking like ruins of a fallen civilization. "You heard her," Martha said. "We decline. We decline the stipend. We decline the guardianship. We decline the name." She pointed to the legal documents that Arthur had tried to force her to sign earlier that week, which were still sitting in his jacket pocket. "You wanted to brand her as incompetent," Martha said. "Now the whole world knows who the incompetent ones really are." She swept her arm toward the audience, toward the investors, the partners, the people who held the keys to the Ashford business empire. "You have lied to your shareholders about your grandson's abilities," Martha said, turning the knife. "You have attempted to defraud a special needs trust, and you have publicly humiliated the only person in this bloodline who actually has the capacity to create value." She looked at Clarissa, who was sobbing silently, her mascara running down her face in black streaks. "Take the $5 million, Martha said. "Give it to Preston. He is going to need it. He has no talent, no drive, and thanks to you, no integrity. He will need every cent of that money to buy a life that looks halfway decent." Martha stood tall, pulling her shoulders back. "As for us," she said, "we are done. Lily and I are leaving, and do not look for us under the name Ashford." She looked at Lily, and a genuine, warm smile broke across her face. "Lily Oakmont," Martha declared, using her maiden grandmother's name, a name that hadn't been spoken in the family for decades. "She will build her own empire, and she will build it on truth, not on the lies you people eat for dinner." She turned her back on them. "Come on, Lily, we have a plane to catch. Boston is waiting." Martha and Lily began to walk down the stairs. As they descended, something shifted in the room. The shock wore off, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming recognition of what had just happened. Someone started clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was a slow, heavy clap. It was Dr. Thorne. Then, the CEO of the tech company at Table 4 stood up and joined in, then the senator, then the headmaster. Desperate to distance himself from the Ashfords, within seconds, the room was on its feet. A thunderous ovation washed over Martha and Lily. It was a wave of admiration for the mother who fought and the daughter who soared. But mixed in with the applause were the whispers, loud and vicious, directed at the stage. "Fools," a banker muttered loudly as Martha passed him. "Absolute fools." "Senile old man," another whispered. "He threw away a fortune." "Cruel," a woman said, looking at Victoria Ashford with open contempt. How could they treat a genius like that? Arthur and Victoria stood frozen on the stage, bathed in the harsh spotlight, listening to their social standing crumble around them. They watched the sea of backs turning away from them. They watched the people they had tried to impress for 40 years cheering for the daughter they had tried to erase. Clarissa sat on the floor, weeping, while Preston stood awkwardly beside her, looking relieved that the lie was finally over, even if his future was in ashes. Martha didn't look back. She walked down the red carpet of the aisle, holding Lily's hand. They walked past the ice sculpture, past the orchids, past the expensive lies. They pushed open the heavy double doors of the ballroom. The night air outside was cool and fresh. It smelled of rain and wet earth, not perfume and stagnation. The valet brought Martha's old, battered sedan around. It looked ridiculous parked next to the limousines, but Martha didn't care. She opened the door for Lily. Lily climbed in. She sat in the passenger seat and pulled her seatbelt on. She looked at her mother. She didn't use the tablet this time. She didn't sign. She reached out and squeezed Martha's hand. 3 times. "I love you." Martha squeezed back. She started the engine. It sputtered, then roared to life. As they drove down the long driveway, leaving the Ashford estate behind in the rearview mirror, Martha saw the lights of the ballroom flickering. It looked small from here. It looked like a dollhouse. "Ready for Boston?" Martha asked. Lily nodded. She pulled up a new window on her laptop. The screen glowed with lines of code, infinite and beautiful. "Ready," the synthesized voice said from the back seat, but this time, it sounded like a promise. They turned onto the main road, accelerating toward the highway, toward the airport, toward a future that belonged only to them. Behind them, the Ashford legacy lay in ruins, destroyed not by an enemy, but by the truth they were too arrogant to see. The heavy oak doors of the Ashford Manor did not just close behind Martha and Lily. They sealed a tomb. Inside the ballroom, the silence that had taken hold during Martha's departure began to fracture, replaced by the murmurs of a crowd realizing they were standing on a sinking ship. The spell of the Ashford invincibility was broken. The guests, men and women who measured worth in stock options and public image, began to retreat. They didn't storm out. They simply drifted away, checking their watches, making excuses about early flights and babysitters, desperate to dissociate themselves from the toxicity that now clung to the chandeliers. Arthur Ashford stood by the melted ice sculpture, his hand resting on the wet tablecloth. He looked like a man who had woken up in a burning house. He watched the state senator, a man he had bribed with donations for a decade, walk past him without a nod. The senator was already on his phone, instructing his aides to scrub any photos of him with the Ashford family from his social media feed. The investors, the ones Arthur needed to secure the next quarter's financing, were huddled by the exit, shaking their heads. The word plagiarism was floating in the air, mixing with the scent of stale champagne. It was a word that meant death in their circles. If the heir was a fraud, the legacy was a sham. Victoria Ashford sat on a velvet chair, clutching a napkin. She looked old. The malice that usually kept her spine straight had evaporated, leaving her frail and confused. She stared at the empty space where Lily had sat. For years, she had looked at that space and seen a void. Now, she realized she had been staring at a diamond and calling it glass. The disintegration of the family happened in the foyer, loud and ugly. Clarissa, her face streaked with tears and mascara, cornered Preston near the coat check. She didn't hug him. She didn't comfort the 12-year-old boy who had just been publicly flayed. She grabbed his shoulders and shook him. She screamed at him, asking why he had to open his mouth. She blamed him for the humiliation, ignoring the fact that she was the architect of the entire charade. But Preston, perhaps inspired by the truth he had seen on stage, finally snapped. He shoved his mother away. He shouted back, his voice cracking with puberty and rage. He told her he hated politics. He told her he hated the speeches. He screamed that he never wanted to be a leader. He just wanted to be a kid. He told her that she was the one who bought the essay. She was the one who threatened the principal. And she was the one who made him a liar. The guests in the hallway stopped to watch the spectacle. The perfect Ashford family was tearing itself apart, loud and messy, right there on the marble floor. It was the final nail in the coffin of their reputation. By morning, the story wouldn't be about the anniversary. It would be about the implosion. Miles away. The atmosphere could not have been more different. The old sedan hummed steadily as it navigated the highway leading out of the city. The darkness of the countryside was soothing, a soft blanket compared to the harsh glare of the ballroom. Martha drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the console. A relaxed posture she hadn't held in years. There was no music playing. There was no need for it. Martha glanced at the passenger seat. Lily was watching the rhythm of the passing streetlights. Slowly, deliberately. Lily reached up. She unclasped the noise-canceling headphones that she wore like armor. She pulled them down around her neck. She turned her head and looked at Martha. In the dim light of the dashboard, Martha saw it. It wasn't the polite, forced grimace Lily sometimes offered to strangers. It was a genuine smile. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. It was a smile of relief. It was a smile that said the war was over. Lily spoke. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but clear. She said that the signal-to-noise ratio was finally optimal. Martha laughed. It was a bubbling, joyous sound that filled the car. She squeezed Lily's hand and agreed. Yes, the noise was gone. The next morning, the sun rose over a world that had fundamentally changed. Martha was in her kitchen, packing boxes. The decision had been made the moment they walked off that stage. They were selling everything. The apartment, the furniture, the memories of a life spent scraping by. It was all going. Her phone began to ring at 8 o'clock. She looked at the screen. Mother calling. Martha let it ring. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Father calling. Then came a text message from Clarissa. It was a long, rambling paragraph about misunderstandings and family unity. It mentioned that perhaps they could meet for brunch to discuss Preston's future role in Lily's management team. As if the previous night had never happened, they were scrambling. They had seen the numbers, the millions of dollars, the MIT contract, and they were hungry. They wanted to attach themselves to the rocket ship they had tried to dismantle. Martha didn't feel anger. She didn't feel the urge to scream at them. She felt a profound, cool indifference. They were strangers to her now. She picked up the phone. She went to the contact list. She selected Mother, Father, and Clarissa. She pressed the block button on each one. Delete, delete, delete. It was the most satisfying administrative task of her life. She put the phone down and taped up the last box. The label on the box read, Boston. 2 weeks later, the air was crisp and smelled of autumn leaves and the Charles River. Martha stood at the edge of the MIT campus. It was a different world. The buildings were a mix of neoclassical grandeur and futuristic glass, a physical representation of the bridge between history and innovation. Lily walked beside her. She wasn't wearing a dress to please a grandmother. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie with the logo of a Linux distribution on it. She had her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. As they walked toward the Ray and Maria Stata Center, a group of students walked by. They were undergraduates, 19 and 20 years old, drinking coffee and arguing about algorithms. One of them, a tall boy with glasses, stopped. He looked at Lily. He looked at the patch on her bag, a specific, rare symbol used by the silent C0D account. He didn't ask where her parents were. He didn't ask if she was lost. He stopped, and asked if she was the one who wrote the patch for the kernel panic issue on the new server build. Lily stopped. She looked at him. She nodded once. The boy's face lit up. He nudged his friends. He didn't treat her like a child prodigy to be gawked at. He treated her like a celebrity. He treated her like a peer. He asked her what she thought about the latency issues in the new update. Lily began to sign. Martha stepped forward to translate. But the boy shook his head. He pulled out his own phone and opened a text-to-speech app. He showed it to Lily. He was ready to communicate on her terms. Martha stepped back. She watched her daughter stand in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by young men and women who spoke her language. Lily wasn't hiding. She was engaging. She was typing rapidly on the boy's phone, her eyes bright, her posture confident. She was home. Doctor. Thorne appeared at the entrance of the building. He saw Martha standing a few feet away, watching the scene. He walked over and stood beside her. He adjusted his glasses and watched Lily explaining a coding structure to a mesmerized graduate student. He told Martha that usually, the university had an orientation for new students, but in this case, he suspected Lily would be the one giving the orientation. Martha smiled. She looked at the massive glass structures of the institute, then back at the small girl who cast a long shadow. The inner monologue that had been running in Martha's head for 7 years, the voice of doubt, the voice of fear, the voice of her father calling her a failure, finally went silent. It was replaced by a new truth. They looked at her and saw a broken clock. They called her the dumb one because she didn't tick to their rhythm. They wanted to hide her in the dark because her light was too bright for their tired eyes. The world looks at her now and sees a revolution. They see the architect of the future. They see a genius who will rewrite the rules of reality, but I don't see the coder. I don't see the millionaire. I don't see the prodigy. I look at her, standing there in the sunlight, finally free, and I just see Lily. I just see my daughter. And that is the only title that has ever mattered. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey of justice, resilience, and the power of believing in the unseen potential within us. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below telling me your country or city. Let's see how far Lily's story has traveled. If you enjoyed seeing the arrogant Ashfords get what they deserved and want to support more stories about justice being served, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Blue Payback. Smash that like button, and if you really want to help us out, hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people who need a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices are the most powerful. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.